August 3rd, 1963. Saturday morning, just after 9. Frank Lucas walked into Bumpy Johnson's office above Small's Paradise on 135th Street. Bumpy was sitting behind his desk, reading the newspaper, a cup of coffee steaming next to him. He looked up when Frank entered, didn't smile, just gestured to the chair. "Sit down." Frank sat. He'd been working for Bumpy for almost a year now, mostly driving, some collections, nothing important, nothing that required thinking, just muscle and loyalty. Bumpy folded the newspaper, set it aside, looked at Frank for a long moment. "Frank, how much money do you have in your pocket right now?" Frank reached into his pants, pulled out a few bills, counted them. $23. Bumpy nodded. "How much do you have saved in total?" Frank said, "Maybe $200, hidden in my apartment." Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "You've been working for me for a year. I pay you $60 a week. That's over $3,000. Where did it all go?" Frank shifted in his seat. "Rent, food, clothes, going out, normal stuff." Bumpy said, "You spend everything you make." "Yes, sir." "That's a problem." "Why?" "Because spending everything means you're always starting from zero. You never build anything. You never grow." Frank didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Bumpy opened his desk drawer, pulled out a $1 bill, set it on the desk between them. "I'm going to give you a test." Frank looked at the dollar. "What kind of test?" Bumpy pushed the dollar across the desk toward Frank. "Take this dollar. In 30 days, I want you to turn it into $1,000. Frank stared at the bill, then at Bumpy. $1,000 from $1? "Yes." Bumpy's face was serious, no emotion. "How am I supposed to do that?" "That's for you to figure out." Frank picked up the dollar, turned it over in his hands like it might give him an answer. "Boss, this doesn't make sense. $1 can't become 1,000 in a month." "It can if you're smart." "But I don't know how. That's why it's a test." Bumpy stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the street below. "Frank, most people think money is something you earn by working, by trading your time for a paycheck. But that's not how you get rich. That's how you survive. If you want to be rich, you have to make money work for you. You have to multiply it." Frank said, "I still don't understand." Bumpy turned around. "You will. You have 30 days. If you succeed, you keep the $1,000. If you fail, you come back here and tell me why. Either way, you'll learn something. Now go." Frank walked out of the office holding the dollar bill, went down the stairs, out onto 135th Street. The morning sun was bright. The sidewalk was already busy. People heading to work, kids playing, vendors selling fruit and newspapers. Frank stood there, looking at the dollar in his hand. $1,000. 30 days. Impossible. He walked home. His apartment was a small one-bedroom on 142nd Street. Cheap, cramped, but it was his. He sat at the kitchen table, spread the dollar bill out in front of him, stared at it, tried to think. How do you turn $1 into 1,000? He thought about gambling. Take the dollar to a card game, bet it, win, keep betting, keep winning. But Frank wasn't a good gambler. He'd lose the dollar in 10 minutes. He thought about buying something and selling it for more. But what could you buy for $1 that someone would pay more for? A newspaper? A pack of cigarettes? Nothing made sense. He sat there for 2 hours, thinking, getting frustrated, getting angry. Then he realized something. Bumpy didn't expect him to figure it out immediately. Bumpy expected him to try, to fail, to learn, to try again. That was the test, not the money, the process. Frank stood up, put the dollar in his pocket, walked outside, headed to 125th Street, the main commercial strip in Harlem. Stores, restaurants, barbershops. He walked slowly, looking at everything, watching people, watching transactions. A man bought a hot dog for 50 cents. A woman bought flowers for $2. A kid got his shoes shined for a quarter. Frank stopped at a newsstand. The owner, an old man named Samuel, was selling papers for 10 cents each. Frank watched. In 15 minutes, Samuel sold 8 papers, 80 cents. Frank walked over. "Mr. Samuel." The old man looked up, squinted. "Yeah? Can I ask you a question?" Samuel shrugged. "Go ahead." "How many papers do you sell in a day?" "Depends. Maybe 60, 70 on a good day. That's $6 or $7. Samuel nodded. "Minus what I pay for the papers. I keep about $3 profit." Frank thought about that. $3 a day, $90 a month. Not enough to get rich, but steady. Samuel said, "Why you asking?" "Just curious." Samuel went back to arranging his newspapers. Frank walked away, kept thinking. Day 1 ended. Frank still had $1. No progress. Day 2. Frank woke up early, 6 in the morning, took his dollar, went to a corner store, bought a pack of gum for 50 cents, 10 pieces. He spent the morning walking around the neighborhood, found a basketball court where kids were playing, waited until they took a break, walked over, offered them gum, 25 cents apiece. The kids laughed. "That's too much. Gum costs 5 cents. Frank said, "Not here it doesn't. You want it or not?" One kid bought a piece, then another. By noon, Frank had sold 6 pieces, $1.50. He'd made $1 profit, but he'd also spent half his original dollar. Net gain, 50 cents. He still had $1.50 total. Not good enough. He needed to move faster. Day 3, Frank took his $1.50, bought a bag of peanuts from a street vendor, 2 pounds for $1. Spent the afternoon outside the Apollo Theater, people going to the matinee show. Frank stood on the corner, sold small bags of peanuts for a quarter each, made 8 bags from the 2 pounds, sold all of them in 2 hours, $2, plus the 50 cents he had left, $2.50 total. Better, but still nowhere near 1,000. Day 4, Frank realized something. He was thinking too small. Selling gum, selling peanuts, nickels and dimes. That wasn't going to get him to 1,000. He needed to think bigger. But how do you think bigger with only $2.50? He sat in his apartment, thought about what Bumpy had said. Make money work for you. Multiply it. Frank didn't know how to invest, didn't know anything about stocks or bonds, but he knew people, and people needed things, services, help. Day 5. Frank took his $2.50, went to a hardware store, bought a sponge, a bucket, and some soap. Total cost, $1. He had $1.50 left. He walked to a parking lot on Lenox Avenue, found the attendant, a middle-aged man named Curtis. Frank said, "I'll wash cars for you. $5 a car. You keep 2, I keep 3. Curtis looked at him. "You know how to wash a car?" Frank said, "I'll figure it out." Curtis shrugged. "Fine, you get 3 cars today. I'll see if people want it." By the end of the day, Frank had washed 7 cars, made $21, gave Curtis 14, kept 7, plus the $1.50 he had left. $8.50 total. Progress. Real progress. Day 6. Frank went back to the parking lot. Curtis had told people about the car wash. 10 cars that day. Frank made $30, gave Curtis 20, kept 10. Total, $18.50. Day 7. 15 cars. Frank made $45, kept 30, gave Curtis 15. Total, $48.50. Frank was exhausted. His hands were raw. His back hurt. But he was moving in the right direction. Day 8. Frank realized he couldn't keep washing cars alone. He needed help. He found 2 kids from the neighborhood, 15 years old, offered them $2 per car. They'd do the washing, Frank would manage, find customers, handle money. The kids agreed. That day they washed 20 cars. Frank made $60, paid the kids 40, gave Curtis 20, kept 0. But he'd built a system. Day 9, 25 cars. Frank made $75, paid the kids 50, gave Curtis 25, kept zero again, but the system was working. Day 10, Frank made a deal with Curtis. Instead of paying per car, Frank would pay Curtis $50 a day for access to the lot, flat rate. Curtis agreed. That day they washed 30 cars. Frank made $90, paid the kids $60, paid Curtis $50, lost $20. Frank went home frustrated. The math wasn't working. He was working harder, but making less. Day 11, Frank sat down, did the math, figured out the problem. He was paying the kids too much and charging too little per car. He needed to raise prices and renegotiate with the kids. Day 12, Frank went back to the lot, told the kids he could only pay them $1.50 per car. One of the kids quit. The other stayed. Frank found a new kid to replace the first one, raised the price from $5 to $6 per car. Some customers complained, most paid. They washed 28 cars. Frank made $168, paid the kids $84, paid Curtis $50, kept $34, plus the $48.50 he'd saved earlier. Total, $82.50. Day 13, 30 cars. Frank made $180, paid the kids $90, paid Curtis $50, kept $40. Total, $122.50. Day 14, 35 cars. Frank made $210, paid the kids $105, paid Curtis $50, kept $55. Total, $177.50. Frank was halfway through the 30 days. He had $177. He needed $823 more. He was behind, but he was learning. Day 15. Frank made a decision. He couldn't get to 1,000 just by washing cars. He needed another stream, something else. He took $50 from his savings, went to a wholesale market in the Bronx, bought boxes of fruit, apples, oranges, cheap, brought them back to Harlem, set up a stand on the corner of 145th and Lenox, sold fruit all afternoon while the kids washed cars, made $30 profit on the fruit, plus $40 from the car wash. Total for the day, $70. New total, $247.50. Day 16. Frank hired another kid to run the fruit stand, paid him $10 for the day. The stand made $25 profit. The car wash made $45. Total, $55 profit. New total, $302.50. Day 17. The fruit stand made $30. The car wash made $50. Total, $80. New total, $382.50. Frank was tired, hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in over 2 weeks, but he was getting closer. Day 18. One of the kids washing cars got sick, couldn't work. Frank had to wash cars himself again. The stand made $20. The car wash made $30 because they were short-staffed. Total, $50. New total, $432.50. Day 19. Back to full staff. The stand made $35. The car wash made $60. Total, $95. New total, $527.50. Frank was more than halfway there, but he was running out of time. 11 days left. He needed $472.50. That was $43 a day. Possible, but tight. Day 20. The car wash made $70. The stand made $40. Total, $110. New total, $637.50. Day 21. The car wash made $65. The stand made $30. Total, $95. New total, $732.50. Day 22. The car wash made $80. The stand made $50. Total, $130. New total, $862.50. Frank was close, so close. He needed $137.50. 8 days left. Day 23. It rained. Nobody wanted their car washed. The fruit stand did poorly because people stayed inside. Frank made $15 total.
New total, $877.50. He was panicking now. 7 days left. He needed $112.50. Day 25. The rain stopped. Frank pushed hard. The car wash made 90. The stand made 40. Total, 130. New total, $1,017.50. Frank had done it, with 5 days to spare. He sat in his apartment that night, counted the money 3 times, couldn't believe it. $1,017.50 from $1 in 25 days.
Day 30. Frank walked into Bumpy's office, set the money on the desk. $1,017.50. Bumpy looked at the cash, then at Frank. Didn't seem surprised, didn't seem impressed. Just said, "How did you do it?" Frank explained. The car wash, the fruit stand, the kids he hired, the deal with Curtis, the price changes, the 2 streams of income. Bumpy listened, didn't interrupt. When Frank finished, Bumpy said, "What did you learn?" Frank thought about it. "I learned that $1 isn't enough to make 1,000, but $1 can start something that makes 1,000. Bumpy nodded. "What else?" "I learned that working alone doesn't scale. You need people, you need systems." "What else?" "I learned that you have to adjust. The first plan didn't work. I had to change prices, change strategy, keep trying." Bumpy smiled. For the first time since Frank had walked in. "Good. You learned." Frank said, "Can I ask you a question?" "Go ahead." "Did you think I could do it?" Bumpy leaned back in his chair. "Honestly, no. I thought you'd give up after a week, maybe 2. "So why did you give me the test?" "Because I wanted to see if you'd try. Most people wouldn't. Most people would take the dollar, spend it, and come back with an excuse. You didn't. You tried. You failed. You adjusted. You tried again. That's what separates people who survive from people who build empires." Bumpy pushed the money back across the desk toward Frank. "Keep it." Frank said, "All of it?" "All of it. You earned it. But I want you to do something with it." "What?" Bumpy said, "Take $500, invest it in something. I don't care what. A business, a product, an idea. Something that can grow. Use the other $500 for living expenses. In 6 months, I want to see what you built with that $500. Frank took the money, stood up. Bumpy said, "Frank, one more thing." "Yeah?" "That test wasn't about money. It was about mindset. Most people think small. They think in terms of hours worked and paychecks earned. You're starting to think different. You're starting to think about leverage, about systems, about multiplication. Keep thinking that way. That's how you get rich." Frank nodded, left the office, walked down the stairs out onto 135th Street. He looked at the money in his hand. $1,017.50. A month ago, this had seemed impossible. Now, it was just the beginning. 6 months later, Frank had turned that $500 into $5,000. He'd started a small numbers running operation, hired runners, built a system. Bumpy noticed, started giving him more responsibility, bigger jobs. By 1968, when Bumpy died, Frank was ready to take over, ready to build an empire. And he did. For 5 years, Frank Lucas was the biggest heroin dealer in New York, made millions, controlled 80% of the market. And it all started with a $1 bill and a 30-day test. In 1975, when Frank was arrested, when everything fell apart, he thought back to that test, to those 30 days. He'd learned how to build, but he'd forgotten another lesson Bumpy had tried to teach him: how to stay invisible, how to stay small enough that nobody noticed. Frank had built an empire, but he'd built it too big, too visible, and visibility got him caught. In prison, Frank had time to think. He realized that the $1 test had taught him half the lesson, how to grow. But Bumpy had tried to teach him the other half too: when to stop growing, when to stay satisfied, when to recognize that more isn't always better. Frank had missed that part. When Frank got out in 1981, he was broke. Everything seized, everything gone. He had less than he'd had in 1963. But he still remembered the test, still remembered the 30 days. One day, a young kid from the neighborhood came to him, asked for advice, said he wanted to make money but didn't know how to start. Frank reached into his pocket, pulled out $1, gave it to the kid, said, "Turn this into 1,000 in 30 days." The kid looked at him like he was crazy. "That's impossible." Frank smiled. "That's what I said too, but I was wrong. It's not impossible. It's just hard. And hard is where most people quit." The kid took the $1. Frank never saw him again. Didn't know if he succeeded or failed. Didn't matter. The test wasn't about the money. It was about the trying, about the learning, about figuring out that limits are mostly in your head. That $1 can become 1,000 if you're willing to work for it, to think differently, to keep going when it seems impossible.